thank you for coming. It's really the department's honor that we have Professor Cowling and come present to us. And I prepared quite a bit to say, but I'll just keep it short. One of the things that one knows with Professor Cowling is that his career has spent several decades as a professional botanist. For those who may not be aware, he obtained his BSc honors and PhD degrees at the University of Cape Town, and he did his postdoctoral work at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. He then served as professor and director of the Leslie Hill Institute for Plant Conservation. He's an A-rated scientist and a world-renowned vegetation ecologist and conservation scientist. Those who know, he has published 300 articles in peer-reviewed journals, authored as much as 5 books. He's one of 2 Africans members of the United States National Academy of Sciences, and the only African who has been awarded a fellowship of the Ecological Society of America. His work has made him a household name in conservation ecology, both in South Africa and abroad, as a result of his determined efforts to help safeguard the biodiversity of the Cape Floristic region, including the succulent karoo and subtropical thicket. His work has led directly to the proclamation of over 100,000 hectares of threatened natural habitat as protected areas. The majority of his work has been applied in areas such as conservation planning, degradation ecology, ecological economics, natural resource management, ecosystem services, restoration ecology, and invasive species biology. He is actively engaged in professional and civic organizations in order to ensure the effective outreach and implementation of research findings. Currently, he is Nelson Mandela University's distinguished professor and research professor and director of the Center of Coastal Paleosciences. I'd like to welcome Professor Cowling to this talk, and hopefully we'll enjoy his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. Who wrote that? Hey? You mustn't believe it all.
Do you want me to get the lights?
Yeah, can you get the lights? Sure. Well, welcome everyone. This is quite a nice, intimate theatre. So hopefully we can have a nice, intimate lecture. And since there's so few of us, if there's a burning question during the course of the next 45 minutes or so, just stick your hand up and we can deal with it straight away. So this is really the story that I'm going to give to you. This reconstruction encapsulates more or less everything I'm going to say. And this is a scene on the Paleogallus Plain south of Mossel Bay about, let's say, perhaps 60,000 years ago. At that stage, it was an ice age, and the sea level was quite a long way from the present shoreline, about 30 k's. Some stages it got as far as 100 k's. There was an area the size of Ireland off this coast here. If you looked out at Skoonies 60,000 years ago, the land would stretch out 10, 15, maybe 20 k's out to sea. And so this is a scene on that Paleogallus Plain. As I said, it was during a glacial. In the background, in the distance there, you can see the Outeniqua Mountains. You know, the ones that you look at when you're at Mossel Bay, at Capes and Blaze, looking over the bay. They're snow-capped. Here, in the background, we see an extensive grass-covered plain. And winding through this really flat, featureless plain was a languid river, very low-energy river, because the topography was so flat. Plenty of wetlands, probably oxbow lakes during flood times that developed around these rivers. And then these barrier dews, like you get at Groenvlei, with wetlands behind them. The soils were rich, unlike the Cape today. The soils of that area were very fertile. And there were herds, large herds of game. All sorts of interesting animals, including 5 extinct species that went extinct about 10, 12,000 years ago when the climate warmed and this plain disappeared. But we'll talk about them later. In the front are our main players, human beings. And these people are regarded as cognitively modern humans. In other words, they had language, they could crack a joke, they had culture, they had art. They behaved overwhelmingly like we do today. They were cultural people. And this is where cognitively modern humans emerged. There's no evidence that refutes that hypothesis, that all of us emerged out on this coastal plain 150,000 years or so. And I'm going to tell the story of what was it that enabled humans to persist when everywhere else they went extinct in a long, cold glacial period. What enabled them to persist in this area? The fact is that there were resources. There were animals that they had to learn how to hunt. That required a lot of sophistication. It required communication. It required collaboration. And they had to develop the tools, which required heat treating certain rocks to make tools fine enough to be functional as arrows. Here we can see men returning with a kill. That's a bluebuck, which is now extinct, one of the species of that coastal plain. In the foreground here are 2 young women adorning themselves with ochre in a perlemoon shell. That's a real sign of cognitively modern behavior. There's a young girl making necklaces out of beads. And here 2 women are sorting bulbs, which they harvested. And we'll see that South Africa, the Cape, is extraordinarily rich in bulbs. And then, of course, shell food. Here's some ladies coming back from the intertidal at Alienite Shore, full of olicroc. And they've harvested those and bringing them back. And of course, shell food provided a really important resource for people. The trick is that in order to exploit these resources, humans had to wire their brains. They had big brains. Homo sapiens, early modern humans had big brains, but there was nothing in their behavior that manifested anything that was, we could call, cognitively advanced. It was only here where this first emerged, and it challenged a lot of long-held views in archaeology and pretty much shook up the world. And it's been happening around us, and I'm not sure how many people are even aware of this exciting scientific story. So I'm going to look at the environments and the food resources associated with the emergence of modern humans on the Cape South Coast. And this is obviously the product of research of lots of people. It's a very complex problem, so you need geologists, climatologists, anthropologists, botanists, zoologists, marine people, whatever. And this is our group at a meeting we had in late June. There are about 30 people. Most are associates of the center, based here at Nelson Mandela University. See, I've got the new logo on. It wasn't easy. Okay, so just a little bit of basic paleoanthropology. I'm not a paleoanthropologist, I'm a botanist. So I could be, you know, this is such a rapidly unfolding field that there are all sorts of things that are left out of this picture, but I think this is the main story. So here is this lineage of Homo, our genus. And round about, what was it, 600,000 years ago, that lineage started splitting into two. One, Homo neanderthalensis in Eurasia, the Middle East and Eurasia, and the other one, Homo sapiens, Africa and the Levant. About, I think it was after about 300,000 years or so, there was no more gene flow between those two populations. They started diverging, developing their own characteristics. And the first Homo sapiens fossils were found about 200,000 years ago, okay, in Ethiopia. And genetics, and don't ask me how they do it, please, I have no idea, identifies the origin point of our lineage, also around about here, between 100 and 200,000 years ago. This was also an extremely long glacial phase. This trace at the bottom here is a proxy for temperature, global temperature. And when that, during that time when these lineages were diverging, the world was in one of the longest and coldest of the glacial periods. So it was extremely cold and very much drier than at present. And Africa in particular was hit hard. There were sand dunes, mobile sand dunes that had developed in the Congo Basin. So the genetic consensus is that modern humans emerged in southern Africa about 108 to 157,000 years ago from a population size of about 9,000 individuals. So human population was extremely low. Humans, Homo sapiens, probably went extinct over the rest of the African continent. And a small population persisted here. And from that population, which wired its brain, developed the rest of humankind. So, where does the evidence come from? It comes from a bunch of caves along our coast. Classes, which is just down the road here. Nelson Bay Cave at Pinnacle Point, you may have heard of, famous cave. Blombos Cave and the Cowlings. I'm just going to take you through a brief overview of the literature. So this is work done by Curtis Marion and his group. A lot of these people are now associates of the Center for Paleosciences. But this was work done some time ago, published in 2007. And what it showed from Pinnacle Point is that there was evidence of culturally modern behavior going back 165,000 years. Now that was mind-blowing, because up until recently, the notion, the generally held notion was that people only got wise in Europe 30,000 years ago. So it was when people went to Europe, they got smart. And that sort of fitted everybody's preconceptions about Europe being smart. But the reality is people got smart here, and that enabled them to get to Europe. Okay. Then this is also a remarkable find. It goes back 162,000 years ago. And essentially, what these guys have shown is that people were capable of engineering silkcrete. In other words, beneficiation. So this is really an industrial enterprise. They were able to beneficiate silkcrete in order to make very, very fine bladelets for their hunting. And in order to do that, the only way you can do it is by heating it. And you have to heat it for a specific amount of time. So you take a bit of raw silkcrete, you add fire. Now it's not just, you don't just chuck it in the fire. People have done experiments and shown that you actually have to keep it at a particular temperature for a particular amount of time, or else the whole process doesn't work. So that would have required a fair amount of cognitive ability. And then they would end up with a tool that was extremely effective. And then, of course, the delightful find from Chris Henshelwood and his group of at Blombos Cave, which is just west of Pinnacle Point, is they found a Palamoon shell with ochre in. So it's a little toolkit. So somebody was working that ochre, and that artifact remained there. Okay, now I don't want you to get too hung up on this terrible picture. It's just to tell you that we've thought about things in how we're going to approach this research as a big group, trying to understand the paleo environments or the paleoscapes in which humans developed. Now, most archaeological research, people go and they find something special, and then they say, whoopee, and they make a story around it. So it becomes, almost anecdotal, and slowly you build up an idea. But we felt it might be better to turn the thing around, to understand the resources, and then make predictions, which you can test with archaeological archives, rather than to find something and then say, whoops, this means da-da-da-da-da. And that's really what this whole business is all about. It's about us adopting approach, and I think I've put it in words here. It's a novel approach, as far as we know. It's not been done anywhere else in the world, where we combine paleoclimate and paleo-environment with the resource base. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. Then we use behavioral ecology, the basic principles of optimization. Animals only going to go for things that it gets sufficient returns on. We assume humans would behave the same way. And then we can figure out from that resource cape how many people there were, what they were likely eating, and then we go to the archaeological record to test our hypotheses. I think I'll give that one a miss. Okay, so now we're talking about this period when modern humans emerged. And as I said before, it was a long glacial. You can see the temperatures where blue down here indicates colder conditions, red indicates warmer interglacial conditions. You can see how short these interglacial conditions were. The one that we live in is here, okay? They last about 10,000 years. Boom, and then another glacial comes. So most of the Cape, or most of the world, was much colder and drier over the last 5 million years than it is now. Okay, so this is just describing the ecological theatre in which humans emerged. And I'm going to take you through the climate and through other features of that environment. So here we have a reconstruction of the area south of Pinnacle Point. So that's the Garden Route, that's the Outeniqua-Titicaca Mountains, PE over there. And this is what it looked like at a full glacial. Okay, so from Pinnacle Point, it was 100 k's. The coast was 100 k's away. And there was this huge piece of land which is now submerged. One of the things that we know from monitoring, predicting coastline distance in relation to how sea levels would have changed is we can see on this axis you have coastline distance, so it would be, let's say, distance from Pinnacle Point, 300 kilometers away, sometimes right on the coast at other times, and here is age. And we can just see how the coastline during cold periods, the coastline is very far away, and warm periods it's right there. What I want you to realize is these fluctuations going up and down are extremely rapid. And we can get an even better idea of how these sea level fluctuations, how rapid they are, because in one of the speleothems, these are the stalactites that has been analyzed, you can get a precise date from a volcano that erupted in Indonesia 70,000 years ago. I think it's called Toba. And it creates shards of glass that are absolutely recognizable. And with that level of, age determination, it's going to be possible to predict climate changes going back 500,000 years, as long as your speleothem goes back at decadal levels. I mean, that's going to be mind-blowing. To know at decadal levels how the climate was changing so long ago. But it was changing very rapidly, and the sea level was changing rapidly. So it's likely that during people's lifespans, they might have seen the impacts of sea level rise. So now just to take you at a peek at what this landscape might have looked like. If you're standing in Pinnacle Point today, this is what you see. If you were standing there 150,000 years ago, this is what you'll see. And a feature about this landscape, which is very different from most of the current Cape, is that it was very flat. It had very low heterogeneity, no mountains or a couple of sand dunes. And one of the consequences for that is that it would have had few fire refugia. And we know from our climate reconstructions that weather conditions would have been conducive to hot fires, because in winter there would have been lots of berg winds, which would have warmed up the environment and made it much drier. So plants living on this plain would have to have been able to deal with fire. Now this rather colourful diagram is, this has been produced by a colleague of mine, Hayley Cawthra. She's with our institute, our centre. She works for the Council for Geosciences. And what we see here is the current coastline. Okay, there's Mossel Bay again, going off towards George over there. This is the Goritz River. When you're traveling from Mossel Bay to Cape Town, you cross the Goritz River. These are some minor rivers. I think this is Kleinbruck or Grootbruck. Anyway, those sorts of rivers. And this is about a strong glacial, so MIS6, 160,000 years ago. And these are the soils or the geology types that occurred offshore. First thing, there were these really broad river basins, river valleys, big alluvial valleys. And Hayley has mapped these features using all sorts of techniques. And then just offshore, close offshore, these brownish rocks were all mudstones, rather like the rocks that you get at Addo or Megantus. You know, really fertile, high levels of phosphorus and so on and so forth. And then down here, the red, and also over there, is calcrete, kind of limestone, stuff that would have been deposited under the sea. And then, at another time, this is a weak glacial, closer to our present time, the area was mantled in extremely large sand dunes, extensive areas of sand dunes, some of which have been mobile, but a lot of which was actually fixed. So one thing that is very clear is this offshore landscape was quite different from the onshore one, particularly in terms of soil fertility. It was overall a fertile landscape, certainly relative to the Cape. Just again, some kind of ideas of what it might look like. This is the coast between Arniston and Bredasdorp, which is essentially a bit of kind of Paleogallus plain, but it was cut much earlier. But it's the same, that's the kind of landscape you would have seen, a bit like most of Australia. The projector is overheated.
No, it is.
Is that okay? So it can explode. And then you would have had these languid rivers with these oxbow lakes, and of course the barrier dunes with the wetlands behind them. An important feature that we have to remember, and this is something that emerges from our most recent climate reconstructions, is that this Agulhas current remained persistently warm through the ice ages, and may well have been responsible for the relatively low drops in temperatures that the models predict that this area experienced. So, you know, on the coast, probably a couple of degrees cooler on average than today. That doesn't mean to say it wasn't cooler than today. 2 degrees is quite a lot, but in many other parts of the world it was 4, 8, 10, or even 15. One thing that the climate models are also telling us is this was one hang of a windy environment. There would have been strong winds, particularly from the west and northwest throughout much of the year. Whoops. And as we mentioned earlier, and what we can still see the remnants of today in places, there probably would have been a lot of sediment being moved regularly across this plain by strong winds coupled with relatively dry conditions. We do know that the rainfall was less than it is today. So now, to get a better idea of that climate over time, one of the things that we do, as I said, is we get hold of stalactites or speleothems. And this is Kirsten Braun, and she loves caves and goes into these horrible places and chips off these stalactites. And I'm going to talk about one at Pinnacle Point. Okay, and the cave is below a bit of limestone fynbos that looks like this. So it's pretty typical kind of fynbos. No grasses or anything like that. And from that cave, Kirsten got a whole lot of bits of speleothem and stuck them all together and got a record that went from 50,000 years ago to 450,000 years ago. So that's a lot of the history of what we call the Pleistocene. I don't want to take you through the details of this because it's very complicated, and I'm sure you're thinking, oh my God, he's not going to explain this. But what I do just want to point out is that in the last 300,000 years in the Pinnacle Point area, there have been times when the rainfall, according to this measure, was coming entirely from the tropics and not from, you know, the normal frontal sources, and where the vegetation was dominated by grasses that are typical of savannas and summer rainfall grasses. And then there were other times when the area most likely had complete winter rain and supported fynbos. So over that period, the climate was extremely variable, shifting from sort of tropical, subtropical conditions to much colder fynbos type conditions. As I said earlier, this plain supported this amazing fauna. These are the reconstructions of the megafauna, the species that went extinct. The longhorn buffalo, its horn would probably be this, as long as this counter in the front. It was a huge animal. The giant Cape zebra would have been right up there, and even a giant warthog. And then in addition to these rather charismatic beasts, there was quagga, or I suppose Birchall zebra. There were 2 species of springbuck. Then there were the normal Cape things like grysbok, and thicket things like kudu and bushbuck, but also waterbuck. I mean, waterbuck now occur way, way north. And then recently, one of our group who walks along the beach and looks at fossil footprints in old sand dunes, he found irrefutable evidence of giraffe. So, you know, those big valleys that we were talking about, those alluvial valleys, likely at some time supported a savanna with acacia karoo. There must have been something like that to keep these guys going. And we know for sure that these animals lived along the coast, because you can use this stuff, what is it again? Oh, strontium, yeah. You can use strontium, which is, you know, again, it gives you some indication of where animals are getting their food from in their teeth, and compare it with strontium in the rocks in that whole Southern Cape area. And the strontium in the teeth is the same level as the strontium in the Bredasdorp rocks, which are the calcareous rocks that prevailed over that coastal plain. Okay, so we don't know much about the hunting resources. We're trying to figure that out. Somebody's working up with a Hadza in Tanzania, trying to get return rates from hunting, and then we're going to have to try and assemble this complex community from scratch. We've got Jan Venter from our George campus helping us with that. But we've done quite a lot of work on some of the other resources that would have sustained these people. And of course, importantly was the intertidal. And we have a very rich and productive intertidal in the Southern Cape Coast, because we share features of the subtropical coast. We've got quite high diversity, but we also get enough influence from the Benguela system to give us productivity. So the high quality diet, rich in omega-3s, allowed the evolution of costly large brains. You've probably heard about this before. It's quite a big deal. And then Curtis Marion has argued that the coastal adaptation in humans was absolutely crucial to the evolution of social behaviors and all sorts of behavioral complexities. So we wanted to get an idea, how important was this resource for people? And the best way to do that, we thought, was to use a modern analog, the existing coast, and then to get people from the local areas who forage a lot in the intertidal, to get them to go out and harvest as much as they can in a particular time, to get some idea of the returns. So was this coastal resource that valuable, as people have argued? And let's see if people today can get a good return. So the prey, I mean, you guys all live along the coast. You've seen all these things before. So what we did is we took a stretch of coastline, about 160 kilometers long, and we divided it up into different habitats. Alienite, a boulder bay, a wave-cut platform, and exposed rocky shores. And then we got people to do bouts to go and harvest in the intertidal. We did hundreds and hundreds of those and used a wide range of different people of different ages and different sexes and so on and so forth. We found that, this is just a random example, that alienite was really the most productive habitat. There weren't really many differences between these three, and that women harvested less, or the returns from women harvesting was less than men, which is neither here nor there, I'm not sure. It was less for boys too, and higher for girls. Anyway, this just shows you the returns of kilocalories per hour, okay, from a whole array of harvesting bouts. Okay, you can see how many we did. Plenty. Each lasted a whole tidal cycle. And then this is the tidal level. So this is when you're getting the greatest range in tide, and this is when you're getting the lowest range in tide. And you can see there was clearly a relationship between tide. There were relationships between weather as well. The big issue was, if the sea was too big or the wind was too strong or so on and so forth. But this is just to give you an idea of how the harvesting in terms of return rate compares to other systems, hunter-gatherer systems. So this is the Hadza women who are in Tanzania. They're hunter-gatherers, Kusad people, and this is the return that they get from harvesting tubers. Okay, these are big fiber-rich tubers. This is shellfish from people, I think somewhere in Indonesia. And this is shellfish from North Australian Aborigines, so that's the level they get. And then bow hunting in the Amazon, well, not the Amazon forest, the sort of warm temperate forests of Patagonia. That's bow hunting vertebrates. So you can see that under good conditions, when there's a good tide, low swell, not a lot of wind, the return rates are absolutely fantastic. They're higher than any other recorded for any other hunter-gatherer system. But the problem is that often the conditions aren't good enough. So you could go through a couple of months in winter when you could barely get down to the shore unless you had access to very sheltered areas. Okay, now I'm going to talk about plants. And I'm going to initially talk about bulbs. And this graph is a species area graph. It shows the number of species, and this axis, the area. And these are for the Mediterranean countries of the world, areas with winter rainfall climates that are renowned globally to have very high numbers of bulbs. There's the Cape. It's off the radar. I mean, you draw a straight line through there, that is just extraordinary. So the Cape has this very rich and abundant resource of bulbs, and also other food plants, which have become, much of this information has been lost over the years, but Ankies, these little things, are still harvested in some areas, and there's certainly a lot of information, both ethnographic, historical, and archaeological, of the widespread use of bulbs. There were also things like palmit. Some of you might know palmit. That's also harvested, and the base of the leaves is eaten, and it's actually given to children. The digestibility is phenomenal, and so on and so forth, and berries and things. So we found that in our study area around Still Bay, there were 58 edible plant species. About 20% of them were bulbs and trees. And interestingly enough, our special biome, the thicket biome, was very important for providing foodstuffs. We've been having a lot of fun trying these things out. A couple of mistakes initially. I mean, some of the bulbs like Watsonias require really careful treatment to get all the tannins out. But once you do that, one of the students working on the project has a flair for this and made us Watsonia bread. I mean, there's just so many things out there that you can do with indigenous plants. These are all little ankies. I think those are little trachyanders, cooked like asparagus. Anyway, great fun. Okay, so what we found looking at the distribution of bulbs across the landscape. So this is the area, Still Bay is here, Riversdale is there, so it's in the Southern Cape. And these are a whole lot of felt types that occur there. And these little dots give you some idea of the number of species. And whether you, within a particular vegetation type or across vegetation types or in relation to landscape or whatever, what did we find? The resource was incredibly patchy. Okay, so we did 100 plots, 83 species, mostly little irids or ankies, almost half were corms. And certainly most of those corms would be edible. We also wanted to get some idea of, not very well focused, eh? Can you see that? Probably not. We wanted to get some idea of the relative abundances in these different vegetation types. And what we found was that, that certainly this habitat, the coastal, right down on the beach, and some of you might know this bulb, Casmanthe, it's very edible, but you've got to treat it, was the most productive, as was some of this felt, the Doring felt, but fynbos was pretty poor. Proper fynbos was pretty poor, but it did have places where you got a big clump of Watsonias where you could get quick returns. And we also found, not surprisingly, that people got the returns when they went into burnt felt were much, much higher. And that enabled them, in the burnt felt, all those bulbs become apparent. So, you know, people have spoken about fire-stick farming for decades, but I think our data is the first to show that fire-stick farming, burning the felt, would have given you a better resource, which would have been an incentive for people to burn the felt from way back. So highest abundance was found in Strandveld, Renosterveld, in the Dune cordon. Very high variation. And also to figure out where to go and to distinguish between toxic and non-toxic species must have required considerable skills. Okay, now I'm not going to take you through this, I'm just going to give you the overall conclusion is that we found that carbohydrate is available year-round. This is the months of the year going into December, the dry period here, and particularly round about March, April. That was a crunch time. And abundance tended to be quite high in the winter and spring months. So bulbs would have been very apparent during winter and spring at a time when perhaps you couldn't get down to the sea because the seas were so big. So it would have been a really good fallback food. And finally, about bulbs, what we've shown, okay, this is the hours to obtain 200 calories, which is the kind of daily requirement. Okay, and these are underground storage organs from different situations, different groups of people, and here's our Southern Cape ones. We can see we've got a fair number of species which don't take a lot of effort to get a fair return on investment in terms of time. And we're doing more work on this and finding all sorts of amazing things about some of these bulbs. Like the levels of starch are phenomenal, 8 times a potato for a particular irid. And some of them have a very high fat content as well. So there's a whole other world to be discovered going down that line. We now have a PhD student, Susan Buerter, who's using that same approach that we use for the intertidal, but on the land. So taking women from local areas who know something about the plants, saying, okay, you go out, forage for half an hour, let's see what you get back, let's work out the returns. And they're phenomenal in some cases. And she's also been, we went to some areas several times over to see if we could deplete the resource. We did that with the shellfish too. We couldn't. In the end, we couldn't deplete it. We were sending people every 2 weeks for 16 months to take as much as they could in a tidal cycle, and it bounced back. The main determinant was the weather and the seas. Anyway, we're doing that for the bulbs as well, and finding again all sorts of resources that we didn't know people used. So all of this complexity that people faced in order to make a living on that Agulhas plain must have influenced their behavior in extremely profound ways. And one of the issues that was absolutely evident is that people must have been able to cooperate. That people had to cooperate in order to hunt, people had to cooperate in order to harvest resources. There were specializations. There were some people who just worked with crude rocks. There were other people who worked with silkcrete. And it was this ability to collaborate that ultimately led to humans being able to become the most dominant animals in the world. And as they spread out of our area, with their well-oiled collaborative initiatives, much to do with warfare and plunder, they brought about the extinction of all the other species of Homo, and there were about 6 or 7 of them, and the extinction of animals, large animals, wherever they went. So those cooperative abilities could be used to do bad things, but they can also be used to do good things. And right now we have the choice that cooperation is embedded in our genes. We just have to marshal it for dealing with the real problems that we face. So just to conclude, modern humans emerged under glacial conditions. They emerged in an ice age, and the location is likely here. The coastal adaptation enabled the evolution of modern cognition, social learning, pro-social behavior, caring about non-kin. What other animals care about non-kin? We do. That's very special. And they went on to conquer the world. The unique combination of resources and relative climatic stability enabled that founder population to persist and rewire its brain and become the awesome and frightening creatures that we are today. Thanks. they said this had to be nearly an hour. Okay, that's what you told me. I hope you're not.
Thank you for that, Richard. We can entertain questions. People, yes, Prof.
Richard, any of these bulbs that you guys have looked at now, is there any that has the potential for commercialization? Are they that productive that they could be considered for commercial bulbs?
Yeah, I would imagine. You know, if you look at Watsonias, you can get fields full of Watsonia if you manage appropriately. The advantage with many of them is that as you harvest them, they're actually producing little bulbs. So harvesting doesn't mean that you're depleting the population. So I think things like some of the Watsonias you could try, probably many more. It'll be small scale initially, but one of the advantages is you could use old fields in areas which are no longer suitable for other forms of agriculture. So you know, it might give you more suited crop.
The data you show indicates that on average there's an ample food supply, but it does get a bit narrow a couple of times in the year. Is there any evidence, have there been any evidence found of storage, plant storage?
Yeah, that's very interesting. There is some evidence that people stored in a cave near Oudtshoorn, Boomplaas Cave. They used to store plain boom, Papia capensis seeds, which were used for all sorts of things. Whether they stored bulbs or not, this, you know, unfortunately plant parts don't last particularly well in the archaeological record. But what we found is that you can store these things for a year and they're still absolutely fine. So it seems likely that people would have learned to store them, and they probably would have carried them around in bags when they were moving around as a sort of fallback food.
What are the uses of Papia capensis seeds?
It's used for an oil, to make an oil, okay, which was used, I'm not exactly sure, it might have been used to ingest or for medicinal purposes.
I've read that Russian critics of Darwinism have argued that cooperation will essentially in cold areas where weather or environment forced humans to cooperate, while in the tropics where Darwin made his observations, survival of the fittest seemed to make sense.
Yeah.
Are you now saying that cooperation is evident even in tropical areas?
No, I'm saying, well, yes, I think human societies cooperate to a remarkable degree everywhere. I mean, you imagine putting a bunch of chimpanzees into an airplane and see how many are left. You know, we're able to get on with each other, and people who aren't from our immediate clan or whatever reasonably well. So that's a trait across all humans. I don't know about the tropical people cooperate less than temperate. I wouldn't believe that. I mean, there are groups in the Amazon, hunter-gatherer groups in the Amazon who have incredibly cooperative behaviors. It's a positive trait we have. We just need to focus on it more.
I have a question, Richard. Given the flat topography that you describe in the Cape, as well as the aspect of flow, I'm just curious, with the river flow in that flat topography, one should be able to at least pick up paleo channels of some of these.
Now that's exactly what Hayley's done. She's picked up the paleo channels of the rivers like the Breede and the Goerits. So the Goerits River, just a couple of kilometers offshore, of the current shore, goes out to being nearly 30 kilometers wide. Okay, so it's a big, big flat feature. And you can see those, even though the edges of those, the channel walls were very low, you can still see a lot of features on the sea floor. And that's probably because the sea level increased so quickly that a lot of these features were preserved. There wasn't enough time to batter them around with waves because the sea level was coming up so quickly.
So they were preserved.
Yeah. And that's what Haley's been making.
I raised this point because it's just in the Macquarie marshes that we're talking about in Australia. One of the things that they were able to show with respect to the flow of water through these marshes, some of these paleochannels that they were able to map can date back to almost 10,000 years with some of the cores. And I just wondered if that perhaps plays out in this system.
Well, we would love to call, in fact there are some calls there that what's it, Suko put in when they're looking for gas. But we've taken a few others that are in those alluvial channels and in what look like wetlands to look at the pollen, because that'll give us a better idea of what vegetation is like.
Interesting.
One of the things that always bothered me about this story is Blombos Cave and all the others are along our current coast. And yet, these coastal line you're talking about is 100 kilometers offshore, 20 kilometers offshore. And it always bothered me in the past that what are the people doing so far away from the resource that you've been describing, the coastal resource?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing you have to realize is that people had a resource collecting radius of about 10 kilometers. That's pretty standard with hunter-gatherers. Certainly that's what they had in Australia and sort of similar environments. And so you only get evidence in the cave when you're fairly close, when people are within 10 k's of the sea. So, there are all these hiatuses in terms of the sediment, in terms of what's accumulated. But fortunately, you can age it quite accurately with strontium, something or the other. I don't know, very complicated. So they know the ages of the sediment. They can see places where there was no more accumulation of animal remains, plant remains. People weren't living there. When the sea was far away, people buggered off. They didn't stay they stayed with the coast.
I think that's where I was going wrong. I was sort of thinking about it as 100 kilometers offshore for all that time.
No,
instead, it was
it's just
moving,
because it was so flat. It was unbelievably dynamic. So any minor change in sea level would result in quite a big lateral, horizontal change in the shoreline. I mean, these guys must have been well versed with climate change.
What are we worried about?
No. Charlene.
Which of the recent discoveries in Morocco, do I understand correctly that because of our rich geophyte cave flora, that makes the big difference between the Moroccan story and our story?
Yeah, well, firstly, the Moroccan find doesn't change anything because the age of that fossil, kind of predates the evidence for cognitively modern humans. So that could have been part of this really sparse red data book species that lurked around in Africa for so long. Pretty useless at everything. Big brain, but actually couldn't achieve much. But people have posited Morocco as another likely place. But I don't know if you've ever looked at the Mediterranean intertidal. I mean, it's a joke. And then the Moroccan side is certainly more productive, but nothing like the Cape. I mean, not nearly.
So they really probably never had an opportunity to become successful because of the story that you're telling.
Yeah, I mean, there's no evidence of shellfish harvesting going back to the ages on this coast. I mean, nowhere, they're all much later. Much, much later. Like 60, 70,000 years as people were moving out of Africa and across the world.
60,000 years ago, were there greater or lesser number of plant species?
Sure. That's a hard one. I mean, the way we're dealing with it is we're trying to model the vegetation, and we're making assumptions that the species, the returns from those model vegetation types would be similar to what we're getting now. But that's quite a big assumption. But we just don't know. We have no other way of doing this at this stage. So we're making an assumption. There's certainly no evidence from phylogenetic work or whatever that was a period of mass extinctions of plants in the Cape. And the intriguing thing is that the western part of the Cape, as judged from those speleothems, from the one near Robertson, shows that the climate remained very stable over the last 500,000 years. So the rain was coming always from the Atlantic, and the vegetation had a signal similar to what you would expect of fynbos. So there was less change, and we think that enabled species just to carry on accumulating. Here, the south coast, there were probably massive changes. So there could have been times when lots of species might have gone extinct, and the bulbs might have been affected, but we can't answer that yet.
Burning question, yes.
Actually, just a question related to this. So your story showed very nicely how the environment had an effect on human evolution. But is there a story the other way around? How people would have sort of contributed to the evolution of the Cape, the environment, in terms of, you mentioned fire stick farming, things like that?
Yeah, I think, the fire regime, if the returns were much better, and it makes sense after a fire with a lot of the bulbs flowering preferentially after a fire, people may well have had a profound impact by managing fire. I mean, they knew how to make fire, and they probably would have figured out very quickly that when you burn some reed beds, then you're going to get buffalo coming in there to eat all the grass that comes back. I mean, they would have figured all that out. So, yeah, it would have had an impact. And maybe that's why we have so many fire-adapted species here. There's a long history of fire, intense fires. Yes?
If I can follow on from that, the Mozambican coastal plain is very strongly controlled currently by fire.
Mm.
People who clear patches for agriculture, subsistence farming. Is there any evidence from that area that could be used in?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Maputoland is another coastal plain, rather like ours. Yeah, interesting, with a lot of sand.
Very much so.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
We must perhaps chat a bit more.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Cowling for his wonderful talk, and that we have refreshments, and if you still want to continue a conversation with Professor Cowling or among the rest of us, please join us for some drinks and eats, and thank you.